presentation and we can, yeah, apologies. I've had FHWA kind of,
Yep. No
planning going on and it just got distracting.
No problem. So thanks everybody for joining. Actually, this is one of our larger turnouts for Wednesday workshops, so that's pretty exciting. Some of the names, like Becky, I'm looking at you, I recognized, and others are newer to me. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is Heather Carlson. I'm the director of Colorado LTAP, and we do these Wednesday workshops to bring you kind of the latest and greatest, the best practices, and information on hot topics. So today we have Josh Keith with CDOT, who's going to talk to us about ADA standards. We're all playing multiple roles as we do in our field. You'll see I'm at a hotel room. We've got a motor grader course happening in Mesa County, as well as an APWA conference. So Josh, when you say you've got a lot going on, I think everybody on the call can certainly sympathize with that. So I will hand it over to you and let you start.
Perfect. So I'm pulling the presentation up right now, and I'm going to think I'm going to present it from our PDF because I think that'll be the easiest way for me to do this virtually. But let me know if we're having issues. And I'm going to fly through some of this because some of this is just stuff that is kind of a time burn in this kind of a situation. So if you really have questions, we can circle back to it. Can you guys all see the presentation?
Yes, now I can.
So let me do that. Okay, so I'm going to truck through this pretty quick. So I am Josh Keith. I'm the CDOT standards engineer, and so I'm the one who wrote the M standard, and I do a lot of the ADA stuff. Jose's name is there. He handles more of the survey 1, 2, 3. I don't know if anybody really has anything to do with that because that's really tied to CDOT projects. But there is stuff that potentially, and he also has all of our data collection stuff. So, feel free to potentially reach out to him as well. And I'm sure there'll be questions. So you can interrupt me, and you probably have to speak up because I can't. I've only got so much screen real estate at home. So I'm gonna, and this is Jose's piece. I'm gonna cook through this pretty quick. So he basically just kind of discusses how many ramps we have here, and a little bit about the Survey 1, 2, 3 application. So not gonna linger too much on these. Again, Survey 1, 2, 3 has gone through a lot of revisions, and it used to be different systems and different names. I think the very first one kicked off in 2019, and we're continuously updating it because there's a lot to, every curb ramp is different. And so he kind of talks about functionally accessible versus actual PROAG being the actual standard, and we kind of had to draw lines in the sand of where we were, how we were critiquing ramps. So I'm more than happy to get into this, but this is, again, stuff that is kind of just a time sink pretty quickly. So I'm going to move on pretty quick. Again, that's kind of how it shows up within the app, which is, mostly for CDOT design side of things, but it also does factor into reporting for to the Justice Department and that kind of thing. So those are things to think about as well. This is kind of just, again, a screenshot of if you were in the actual system, kind of looking at data within it, and just kind of it sprawls it all out there in the many pieces of information associated with each ramp. So some of this, I think I'll probably make all of these slides available as well. And again, there's a lot of resources. A lot of these are on a combination of the Civil Rights webpage and in the M standards, where you would find the M standards. There's also some links to some of this. So just kind of a look at everything that there is. We are also, for everybody's information, we are working on a Spanish version of the curb ramp M standard that has a long ways to go, but we are working on it. And it won't be an official M standard, of course, because we don't want it to be confused with the actual contract documents, but that is in progress. Yeah, just kind of links to survey 1, 2, 3 and everything. Okay, so kind of just getting into why this is becoming more and more of a topic. You know, what percentage of the U.S. population has a disability? It is, you know, this is 2010 data. This is, and I think this is all on the low side a little bit. You know, over 21% of the U.S. population has a disability of some form, and 70% will have a temporary or permanent disability at some point in their life. So if you've ever been on crutches or had surgery or a major illness, I think, you know, I think everybody can relate to this to some degree, that for a while you are not at 100% capacity. So everybody, basically, this touches your life at some point for some amount of time. And so we kind of get into the history of the laws, and the biggest thing that to take away from this is that there are a number, you know, this has gone back all the way to 1968, and it's got more and more restrictive as time goes on. And basically with the ADA Act of 1990, public and private, there's no escaping it at that point. You are obligated to provide access. And then we kind of discuss a little bit about standards, and the fact that there's standards, and there's always going to be some degree of, you're never going to build it exact. So, you know, you have to have something that you're kind of working off of. And again, for buildings and sites, ADA is ADAG. And for streets and sidewalks, it's PROAG. And PROAG has not been adopted into official law as of yet. It's heading that way. And we're getting a lot of background noise there. So what does ADA require? So basically, the long and short of it is that you can't discriminate against persons with disabilities by excluding them from services, programs, or activities. These statutes require that agencies provide pedestrian access for persons with disabilities to the agency's streets, sidewalks, and pedestrian facilities wherever such facilities exist. So what does that mean is you have to remember that a push button is a service. It's viewed as a service. So there is obligation to provide access to those things. And the same is true of a sidewalk, and therefore kind of curb ramps as well, because they have to be able to get to the sidewalk and maneuver between portions of the sidewalk and around intersections. Both of those are viewed as services. So right there, legally, there is obligation to provide these things, and in an accessible manner. So what are the requirements related to construction and existing facilities? So for new constructions, it's just at this point in time required to be accessible and usable by persons with disabilities. There's really no there's no way out on that. It just is what it is. Alterations to existing facilities. So that gets a little bit, there is room, because we do realize you can't rebuild an entire intersection and, you know, an entire run of sidewalk attached to a city block. So it gets to the maximum extent feasible. PROAG discusses within its kind of opening introduction um, what that maximum extent feasible is. And, the long and short of it is you can't use things like, you want to use scope of the project. What is the scope of the project? Because you don't want to wander into it's too expensive, because that's not an argument that really flies. Um, Existing facilities that have not been altered shall not deny access to persons with disabilities. So existing facilities, policies, and programs must be evaluated for discrimination. And that's part of why we do all of our transition plan and everything. So, and basically every entity is required to kind of, do what we were doing and collect data and plan for the future. And again, PROAG establishes the accessibility criteria within the public right of way. So I'm going to cruise through these pretty quickly too. So just things to think about, before you actually design is, right away, you don't want to be dealing with right away once you get to construction. And I kind of get into, a lot of times there'll be like a business that owns a portion of a curb ramp. And so sometimes they are reluctant to let us do anything because they're scared that it's going to interfere with business. And you kind of need to talk to these folks and get out there as quick as you can. Kind of a last ditch maneuver with some of this is to remind them that they are also responsible for a curb ramp that's not up to spec. And so if something happens, and they don't allow us to fix the curb ramp, some of that comes back onto them too. And so just a lot of things to think about, and always inlets and, what kind of ramp is going to work where. Um, so, this is just kind of some quick points about construction with drainage and islands and concrete pavement and landscape items and that kind of stuff. The one point too here is that just be wary of contractors who will assert to you that they have done this before and they are an ADA expert. I've seen that burn a lot of projects, and we still need to do our due diligence and pay attention to what is getting built and try to keep an eye on the design if you're overseeing that as well. Just some more things to kind of be aware of. Pull boxes are kind of a big culprit. They, in the past, have wound up in terrible locations in the middle of a curb ramp. And it's not to say that you can't do that, but it does make it difficult. Somebody who has some mobility issues, maybe using a walker, or if you're blind, it's hard to get that pull box exactly level and not be a trip hazard or a slip hazard. So just kind of things to quickly be aware of. Yeah, I'm not going to linger here too much. This is just a few things we went through pretty quickly. And this is more for a CDOT job. We require MHT to be site specific, and more pedestrian detours. You need to provide a route through your construction, and you can, as long as you have a plan in place, that certain members of the crew are going to be spotters who can be helping people through. That's something that can be done. And the pedestrian barricades is a tough one, because I get a question of how often must you have something. And I guess I would say that if you're going to shut down a corner, like if you're going to shut down a corner of an intersection overnight, and there's the possibility that someone could come through there, that is, you need to think about being able to allow those people to get through your construction zone versus just putting up, caution tape. So we do have a tolerance memo attached to curb ramp construction. And then we have a couple of chapters in our design guide, like chapter 14 for bike and ped. I think chapter 12 is pedestrian accessibility, if I remember correctly. Um, so this is just a slide that's it's kind of it's giving you who are the people you're designing for, whether it's diminished vision, someone in a wheelchair, someone who is blind, someone who is using a walker, even someone who's using a set of crutches. Those are the kinds of things that I don't think we always think about, and so I kind of throw this in there for designers. Where do some of these dimensions actually come from? Like the 3 foot you see a lot, and then kind of the 5 foot is also a dimension you see quite a bit. And just kind of another look at kind of the user there. So this just kind of defines curb ramp elements. The one thing I kind of want to talk about that you see a bunch is the actual pedestrian access route. And generally that's viewed as a 4 foot wide minimum, 5 foot width recommended. And this is set back from the curb. So sometimes you have a park strip where you would have like your furniture or to allow for parking and that kind of thing. You've got your curb and gutter, your detectable warnings, your turning space, level landing, and then some of your different slopes, your flares. But generally the pedestrian access route is what we really want to keep clear. And that's where the expectation is there won't be something to obstruct someone who's just trying to get through. So someone who's blind or with mobility issues, that's where you want to keep super clear. So one thing that I think kind of gets forgotten sometimes is this: once you've made a perfect curb ramp, if you've got resurfacing going on or asphalt coming through, we tend to leave that asphalt windrow right there in front of the curb ramp, and sometimes there's a pretty good bump there, and all it would take is a couple minutes with a grinder. And that's something to consider, because if you're in a wheelchair or even just, again, a walker, that windrow can actually be detrimental to someone who's just trying to get across the street. And we sometimes forget about those things as people who maybe don't have any issues with mobility. So something I'm trying to get people to think about. So again, just kind of some of the different ways to do that transition, from the curb ramp to the street, and things to think about, especially when we're doing a lot of mill and overlay everywhere all the time. There are better ways to do it than this upper left picture, which only gets worse every time you do it generally. As far as vertical discontinuities, the big thing is that it's basically a 1/4 inch max if you're not going to do anything. If you bevel it, it can be up to a 1/2 inch. So basically anything over a 1/4 inch, which is why I try to say in new construction, try to get it as flush as you can, because it's only going to get worse over time. So if you start out with an 1/8, it will grow pretty quickly generally. So this is again looking at your entrance to the street. The algebraic difference there between the two. The maximum is 13.33. Mostly for wheelchairs, just because it makes it very hard for a wheelchair user to navigate anything more than that. So I'm going to get into a little bit of where those flares are needed. Return curbs should only be used where pedestrians cannot or do not have access to walk across the ramp. So basically, if you have grass or gravel or landscaping, then you don't need a wing. You don't need that actual wing there. You can just do a return curb. But anywhere that people can continue walking and might not notice what's going on, you do actually have, you've got to get rid of those trip hazards. So that curb ramp on the left there is so close. If they had just kind of done that a little bit differently, it could have been perfect. So CDOT generally defines our curb ramps as either perpendicular, parallel, or blended transitions into pressed corners. And we also kind of do combination ramps, which kind of make use of elements of all of them. So I'll talk about them all kind of real quick here. The perpendicular curb ramp, this is the standard one that everybody's probably the most aware of. You've got, the biggest thing is that you've got your level landing area at the top in the orangish, pinkish color there. And that's so the wheelchair person can orient themselves before going down. And then in some instances, you will need a clear space at the bottom, which I'll get into a little bit more, where if you've got two crosswalks, again, they can orient themselves if you've only got one ramp. So they can orient themselves before going across. So you've got your typical dimensions. 8.3 is generally your max running slope. We try to say 7.5 is your preferred. So if you shoot for 7.5, then with tolerances and construction, you should still be able to hit that 8.3. So again, grade brakes. Grade brakes are something that we definitely need to do better with. Skewed grade brakes cause a lot of issues for people in wheelchairs, and it should always be perpendicular to the direction of traffic. So that's the big point to drive home. So if someone is in a wheelchair is coming down that, it should be perpendicular to them. So these vertical curve faces that kind of separate two ramps, we see them a lot, and they can make sense. They kind of help to add a little bit of separation, but the things to remember is that when you've got a small one, like the lower right there, those are more of a tripping hazard, and they become a snowplow catch. So they probably, you might have been better off just not doing it quite like that, or having not quite you could have lowered the front face of that curb a little bit to make it not quite such a just a point. You could have made it a little bit bigger. You could have oriented those ramps a little bit differently. It's just things to think about when you're doing design. So again, just kind of getting into your grade brakes and laying this out and realizing that the person is coming through this, whether it's, in a walker with a cane or a wheelchair, how is that person going to navigate what you've constructed? And the top one is pretty tough, and just could have been done a little bit better. And so here I'll talk a little bit about, so generally, again, we don't allow apex ramps, in new construction, but sometimes there is a place and a time for everything, and we still do have these diagonal apex ramps. So the thing to think about is that when that person in the wheelchair gets to the bottom of the ramp, do they have a way to orient themselves for the two crossings? And so that's what the acceptable design is trying to show. And the other thing to think about there is that there will be confusion for the drivers as well, because they won't be sure where that person is going until they start to make the movement. So you have turning traffic. These are all things to think about. But again, the diagonal ramp has to be contained within both crosswalks. So things to think about with apex ramps. We generally advise against them, but there's always a place where it may be the best option for an alteration. So then again, this is kind of showing exactly what that drawing was intending to show. So if you extend out the driving lanes, the person in the wheelchair still has a pretty safe spot at the bottom of that ramp. So um, they can orient themselves and be out of the direct line of traffic. Um, so again, just this kind of gets into a little bit of redundancy here. Yeah. Parallel ramps, again, parallel ramps are, and I guess one other thing to mention right away is that sometimes people get caught up in designing to the minimum or the maximum. You know, they see that 48 inches is the minimum, and so they just lay out the ramp to 48 inches. There's never any issue with over designing or making the ramp bigger. If making the ramp bigger solves your issue, then that's a good solution. We had one example where there was basically a telephone pole that was obstructing the curb ramp, and there was a lot of discussion of moving the pole and everything. And it was the simple solution was just oversize your ramp a little bit, and that telephone pole is no longer an option. So things to think about. Again, you've got the 8.3 to get down to the landing area. And again, 48 inches would be your minimum, but with something like this, a lot of times 60 is a preferred dimension for that. And then again, sometimes you might need that clear space once you kind of enter the street there. So mid-block crossings are a little bit of a different thing too. And then if you have yield or stop control, some of those things can affect your, the turning space of the cross slope can equal the highway grade. So if anybody wants to get into that, I'm more than happy to discuss that more. So blended transitions and depressed corners are something that I talk to our engineers about a lot. I know a lot of our young engineers are like, this is the solution. They see this and they just think this is the best thing, and they go right to this. But these are often done poorly, and really these only make sense in a few locations. Something like the stadium or something like federal buildings where you have a lot of people coming and going, and you have a lot of real estate of sidewalk, that can make some sense. But on a typical corner, I caution people not to do this. There's usually a better design. So it's something that I say if they're going to do it, we should probably talk about a little bit more to make sure it gets. There's a lot of dimensions and a lot of points that the contractor needs to hit to make sure these are built correctly. So it's just something to consider. So this one is from downtown Denver. You can see that the picture there, that's actually a pretty well done one. And it makes sense given kind of what you've got access to and how it kind of interacts with the street. But the lower right kind of shows you, traffic coming through there isn't always aware and don't realize what pedestrians are doing. And so your conflicts and risk for conflicts is quite a bit higher. So this is kind of a before and after that was well done. They also got rid of a light pole there and other things. So yeah, the after is clearly far better here. And then, so I think that people misunderstand what detectable warning surfaces are for. And so the question that I often ask is, what do you think they are intended for? And what they are for is indicate the boundary between a pedestrian route and a vehicular route, where there is a flush rather than a curb connection for pedestrians who are blind and have low vision. Detectable warning surfaces are not intended to provide wayfinding for pedestrians who are blind or have low vision. And I think sometimes the assumption is just err on the safe side and put them in, but that's not really what you should do, because there's an expectation for people with diminished vision that they're about to enter something. And so, basically a street. So that's why sometimes out in front of, say, a Walmart, they do make sense because you are entering something where there's a lot of crossing traffic. But, you know, defaulting to putting them there as the solution is not always a good idea. And so this is kind of just taken right from our standard, and it just kind of shows orientation in relation to ramps and kind of what we're shooting for. 2-foot minimum width, and then kind of the width of the landing area as well. But there is some flexibility and tolerances with that. It doesn't have to be exactly perfect, but basically it's if someone is walking, their foot's not going to miss it, is what we're shooting for. And then this kind of just gets into the expectation that blind people have, that as soon as they hit it, they're within 5 feet of the actual roadway. I've seen these placed as far as, 20 feet back from the actual flow line, and that's going to be very confusing to the person with diminished vision. So that's why that's where that 5 foot or less is coming from, and why we kind of really specify that. And there's always ways to do things. Again, you can do it as an arc that covers the whole opening, or you can try to do different ways. But the biggest thing again is that you're positioning these where the person walking out in the crossing is going to catch them as they go through. So just a picture of kind of a straightforward design there. Similar, so they've given a lot of ways for someone in a wheelchair to get through there, even though you've got the push buttons and kind of the detectable warnings. But this one has an issue in that someone with a visual impairment could, in theory, walk right straight through there and never encounter the detectable warnings, which is why in this case, putting it on the arc or the radius there would have probably been the better choice. And so just real quickly, MUTCD has a lot of good guidance. We try to get a lot of this out in front of our people and in some of our, our design chapters and that kind of stuff. But one thing that I will say, and I try to repeat to all of our folks, is that most of the language in the MUTCD is a should and not a shall. So be very careful with that, because I've seen decisions made because people thought it was a shall, and it's a should. The next page, these 2 points here, 7 and 8, where 2 pedestrian push buttons are provided on the same corner of a signalized location, the push buttons should be separated by a distance of at least 10 feet. But don't put the person in a wheelchair in your gutter pan because you wanted to stick to this 10-foot rule. You got to use some logic and common sense in there. We have done that to our people, and I've tried to explain that that's not a good decision when the front of the wheelchair is in the pan. Generally, yeah. Again, don't use stickers. Make sure your signs are clear and easy and can be, again, make sure your push buttons are where people can find them. If you have trouble finding a push button, then a blind person is never going to find it. If you put it behind a bush or you put it behind guardrail, the people who need to use it can't. So again, you just kind of want to align it with the crossing. It needs to be somewhere where that everybody can get to it, where it's findable. These are some good examples. So I'm not going to go through, I didn't even go through this with all of our folks in detail. These are just different things that you need to think about, and the rules are a little bit different if you've got the speaking ones, the ones that make noise, the volume needs to be adjusted correctly. There's just a lot of considerations with these, and making sure that a blind person can understand what they're doing. So you can put them on the same pole. It just kind of, there's different requirements for doing different things. Again, every situation is different, so that's why we kind of try to throw a lot of these out there. Again, yeah. So these are hard for people to find, and it would be very confusing for a blind person what is actuating what, and there's some inconsistency there. So again, MUTCD kind of gets into giving examples. We try to give some examples in some of our different things. My main point is that you just really, when you're laying out a design, you need to think about your user and if they're going to be able to find it, get to it, use it, and then get across the street, all in the same kind of span of time. And so I think everybody knows that we have the M standard for curb ramps. So that is, and it's M608-1. So that's kind of the slideshow very quickly. I do realize I didn't want this is stretched out to 2 hours sometimes, so I didn't want to do that for everybody. But definitely, if anybody has any questions, we can roll through some of that.
Okay. Any questions? Okay, well, I want to give special thanks to Josh for coming and sharing with us. Josh, if you're comfortable with it and you can send me the PowerPoint that you just walked through, I can post this with the recording on our workshops page on our site.
For sure. Yep. I'll get that to you.
Okay, great. One last chance for questions. Okay, well, thanks everybody. Thanks, Josh, for your time, and have a good rest of your week.
Thanks.